after a crash. So Cinema decided to die like I figured it would, but fortunately I was saving frequently. So here we go. There's something with my computer. I'm actually going to update the operating system and everything and hope for the best because it's been crashing a lot recently. Okay, so we had set noise as the way to create a kind of, dirty appearance on the surface of this gold. But let's go ahead and look at adding scratches. Now I had gotten pretty close and then everything failed. So let's start this again. So we need to be able to also potentially use an image, ideally a black and white image as a source for our okay, so picking up where we left off before Cinema crashed on me again, we are going to be looking at how to add an image as a way to mess with this texture. Now, we can do full color images and actually have those applied to the color channel, or we can use black and white images and have those applied to roughness. And where we get those images from is pretty much open, but the way that when you're working with 3D space and when you're applying an image to a 3D surface, we call that a texture. And so if you're looking to add an image to the surface in some way, you want to find a node called texture. So if I go ahead and double click and wait for this to load and come down here to texture at the bottom of the screen, and wait for this to load, you'll see that there are a whole bunch of options here. The one we want is texture. Also note that max on noise is available here. But if we go ahead and double click on texture, it'll drop this node in here. And if I look over at the settings for this node, you'll see there's this path option. That's basically the file path for where this image can be found. If I want to load something that's already on my computer, I can click on this little folder over here. And I can find any old image. Let's see, do I have anything on this folder, on the base folder? Let's just go to 2024 spring. And because we're using these photographs anyway, right, we could load this photograph in. And you'll see it's applied there. And if I was to drop this into the color channel for this material, we would potentially have a very warped image of Tutankhamun projected on Tutankhamun's face, right? We could maybe align this correctly using some of these settings. Earlier, I noticed that the offset didn't seem to be working for me, but maybe I just need to set this up, and maybe it has to. Maybe it's one of these things where I actually have to click there to get it to update. I'm not 100% sure. Or it's something where I need to enable something else in order to change it here. But I'm not going to worry about it too much, right? This is just a demo that you can actually put an image right on this channel. And so let's go ahead and disconnect that. What we do want, though, is we don't actually want an image from our hard drive in this case. We're going to be using a texture file from Cinema 4D's asset browser. So I'm going to go up to Window. I'm going to go to Asset Browser, and this is where it crashed last time. So we'll see if this works. If I go into my search and I search for scratches, or just scratch, right, there's all sorts of things that come up. There's these folders, but what I'm really looking for is image media. And specifically in my case, the image I was hoping to use is one of these here. Now, if they're so small you can't see what these are, this little slider here allows you to make the size of the thumbnail a lot larger. And so for some of these, you'll see it looks like they have all this information kind of laid out in a weird way. These are UV mapped image files. And so what this does is whatever object this is supposed to be attached to, this lid, what this does is it basically will, we're not going to talk about it now. But basically, right, it's a UV map. It allows you to have these different scratches in different places on the geometry. We're not worried about that. We're just worried about scratches on the surface of the geometry. And so this is the file I was trying to do before. It's just a JPEG image. It should work. So before I go any further, what I need to do is I need to make sure I have my texture node selected. Maybe save the project right now. And then what we need to do is, instead of clicking this download link, we should just be able to drag this and drop it into this field. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this. I'm going to drag this over here. You see it turns from a no symbol to a hand symbol, and it should say download assets, and it should load that image, and then this should update. So let's go ahead and just swap the scratches for our noise real quick. So I'm going to go ahead and pull this over and just snap that in there, swap out those scratches, and I'm going to wait a second and maybe refresh the IPR. There we go. Right, so I had to refresh it. So I want you to note that this is like a really intense amount of scratches. Again, you can see that, right, it's either all or nothing in here. And so but I also want you to note, though we can maybe make some changes to the position, I have noticed rotate seems to work pretty well, right? I can rotate these scratches around, so if I want them slightly different than where they were, that works. It was just the scale and the offset was not functioning for me. Now, the one setting we have right now is this custom gamma. So if I was to increase my gamma some, you'll see that that basically makes these significantly darker and thicker, right? And I can just, crank this up even more, and they're going to be more pronounced on the surface. If I dial this down, right, they're going to be less pronounced, right? We're going to leave our gamma at 1 for now because it's not going to give us enough freedom to do the things that we need to do in this case. And one thing I want you to note is that, right, what we would like is for the scratches to be the less shiny part, and the unscratched areas to be shiny. But right now, the problem is this is backwards, right? Basically, we want the background to be black and the scratches to be white. So let's look at another node that's going to help us do that. Notice that this says out color. Right, so that usually gives us a hint as to what type of node we should do. So I'm going to go ahead and double click. And what we want to do is we want to invert the color. So if I type invert, you'll note that there's a couple options here. There's 3. There's vector, float, and color. Because this is a color object, it's best to use the color invert. And if this results in something crazy, then we'll use the float invert. But we're going to see what this does first. So I'm going to double click. I'm going to drop this into the input and wait a second for this to show up. And now you'll see it is inverted. So now if I take this and drop this into my roughness, I should have the opposite result. And I do, right? It's really super highly reflective everywhere except for where these scratches are, right? They are, right, they're totally 100% white at this point, or very close to it. And so they are making that as rough as possible. And again, this isn't quite what we want. There's a couple things we can do to resolve some of this. And so I want to show one more node, and then we're going to actually merge these two together so we can use both at the same time. But so we've inverted the color, but now we need to be able to manipulate that color in some way, shape, or form. So if I just double click off in space and I select my color options here, you'll see that I have color correct as one of the nodes that I can get. I can do composites as well. This color one just allows me to create a solid color, but we're going to go ahead and use color correct. And once I've done color correct, I need to put in my input. So I'm going to go from the out color on my invert to this input. I'm going to save this again because you know what? It could break. And then there's a bunch of settings here, right? I could go in here and adjust the settings. Like I can, basically what this means is I can adjust any of these settings by connecting a different node to it. We're not going to do that right now. We're just going to go ahead and do this within the node. And so there's a couple of things I can do. I can adjust contrast, right? I can adjust my level, which basically, right, if I pull this down, right, I'm going to go ahead and get a different result. Not quite sure why it decided to do that. I might go ahead and stop this so that I'm using a little bit less GPU. I'm going to save this. There we go. And now, so ideally, my preview should go a little bit faster, but you can see what this is doing, right? It's dimming everything down so that these scratches are potentially like less vibrant. I'm going to put level back up to 1. Already, this is desaturated, right? Even though it has 100% saturation, this is a black and white image. There's no color, so it's already desaturated. We don't need to worry about hue shift. Contrast and gamma are the other two that we could potentially adjust. If I decrease my contrast some, right, that should help out a lot. And then I could either, again, gamma and level are going to give us similarities. Gamma makes big changes pretty quickly, so it might be good to go to the level and drop this down. And really what we want is we want something where we don't have quite, like we have a similar tonal range to this image down here, because we were pretty, or to this image, because we were pretty happy with that. So we're going to go ahead and drop this even lower, which should smooth some of this out. It makes even less black areas. And what I might do is I might pull my gamma up just a touch. Or pull my gamma down, I can't remember which direction it goes. I'm going to go up a touch and see if that makes it darker. I'll go up a jump and just see, is that, okay, perfect. So this is bringing those low end colors up a little bit, right? Because we don't want it to be perfectly black because that's too shiny. So now we've got something that I think is going to work. And there's only one way to test it. And so I'm going to save this, right? So my nodes don't get lost, all that tweaking I just did there. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Start IPR. And once I do that, it's thinking, it says that this is still pumping out. Oh, I forgot something, right? I was like, why is it still so bright? It's because I failed to connect this where it goes there. So I'm going to stop this again. I'm going to go ahead and attach that and then restart this. And it says it's preparing the materials and the shaders. So now, granted, the scale of my scratches might be too big, but you see how now I'm actually getting some really nice looking scratches on the surface of this material. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit here, so we can see these a bit better, right? So I'm getting, so the material, the surface is scratched up, but again, they're huge, right? So I'm going to need to be able to scale that down. So if we go to our texture tab, we can see if we can adjust the scale. Let's go ahead and set this to 0.5 and 0.5. Okay, now I want you to note what happened. I made the scale smaller and the scratches got bigger. So let's go ahead and do this the opposite direction. Let's say 4 and 4. Oh, well, that's 5. That's going to tweak it a little bit, but let's just say 4 and click off here. Okay, right? So this is, to me, increasing the scale should increase the size, but what it's doing is it's basically increasing the numbers of copies of this image that are being projected on the surface. Right, so I have 4 copies and 4 copies, right? The word scale is a little bit misleading. They used to call it tiles, and so it would be like 4 tiles by 4 tiles, right? But that's not the terminology they're using. And so now we've got this gold material that's got some smudges on it mixed in, or it doesn't have any smudges on it, but right now it's got all of these scratches on it. I might go ahead and go to 8 by 8. Just so that we can have those scratches be even finer on that surface. Redshift, doing this in previous iterations of Cinema 4D was kind of a nightmare. And it just, like, granted, yeah, it crashes a lot, but man, it makes things so much easier. Okay, so we've got our scratches in the surface. That's fantastic. Now what we'd like to do is, it'd be great if we could merge these two together or composite them together. And so I'm going to go ahead and pull my texture over. I'm going to make some adjustments here so that this looks somewhat logical in the way that it's organized. And I'm going to go ahead and move this over. And I need to create one more color thing. And there's a couple different options here. If I go ahead and double click and go to color, there are several ways we can manipulate this. First, there's color composite. There's color layer. And those are the two that are the easiest to use. And then on top of that, there is this color math. And there's certain things in here like where you might notice like color invert is in here, color saturate. There's some other things here. But then there's also these floats. And one of these floats is multiplication, division, all of that. Now, you may know that there's a blend mode for images called multiply in a lot of software. And all that is it's literally multiplying the one image by the other's color value, right? And so because it's such a common thing, even though this is a float, you can send it a color object and it will output a color object and you will get a multiplication of those two. But we're going to go ahead and start by using the one that's kind of custom made for this, color composite, double click. And then with color composite, we have a couple channels. We have the base color. In this case, I'm going to say, let's make the noise our base color. And we are going to take the output of this color correct and make that our blend color. Then we want this output to come over here and be connected to our roughness. Now, if I select the color composite, I want you to note that I have my base color, I have my blend color. If we look here, I don't see any scratches though. And that's because the composite mode by default is set to base color. It just basically passes the base color through to wherever you're heading it to. So if I click there, you'll see I have a whole bunch of options in here in terms of how I want these to blend. Now, in our case, I'm not sure if add or average or subtract or multiply or whatever is going to be the best. We're just going to have to look and see. I feel like multiply is going to make this far too dark and it's going to be really glossy, but let's go ahead and try that first. Right? It did exactly what I thought it was going to do, right? It made it far too glossy and we still don't have any scratches. So let's go ahead and come over here and let's try add. That's another very common one. Okay, this works. But again, right, it's brought the lightness of this entire thing up. So we're getting a lot more in there than we had previously. Let's do average. Let's see what that does. Average is not just average. It actually looks pretty great. I'm really happy with how that looks, at least on that part of the model, right? We'd need to check elsewhere and see. But again, you can go through and you can just check, you know, a bunch of these different options. If we did, you know, we could do lighten, which is somewhere between add and average, right? We've got more scratches. That one's actually really nice. It's more, it shows off a bit more. And then we have, let's see here, we could do screen. We could try that, right? That's probably too much. Hard light's definitely not going to work out for us. Soft light might be another good option, but really it's not really working very well either. You can see that it's actually made this pretty dark. Subtract, probably not our best option. We get some interesting results, like if you wanted something with flakes in it, that might be nice, but that's not what we're going for. So I think lighten might be our best option. I haven't tried burn or some of these other ones. I know some of these last ones aren't going to work at all. But I think that let's go ahead and just say lighten is the one that I prefer. And it does, if you look at this, right, it's similar. It's like slightly lighter in tone. We could, right, use another color correct in between here if we wanted to like darken it just a touch, but I'm pretty happy with where this stands. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Right, and I'm going to go ahead and move my scene around just a little bit, see how this looks on other parts of the model. Right, wherever any of those specular highlights are, look at what happens to the shadow here. Right, we've really done some pretty impressive things to make this look like it's been somewhat abused. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in just a touch. Right, so you can really see these scratches and how they're impacting the reflection on the surface here. Now there's one last thing we can do if we'd like to with this. And that is that we could apply our scratches to the bump channel. And what the bump map does is it kind of fakes height. Right? So it fakes there being a change in height on the object. And the way it works is that anything white is raised, anything black is recessed, and gray is the original surface of the object. So knowing that, I'm going to go ahead and stop this render real quick. But knowing that, I know that this is mostly gray with a few scratches. And this is the color-corrected scratches, right? So let's just go ahead and drop our scratches onto our bump map. And I'm not quite sure why it's doing that. We're going to see if I've made a terrible, terrible mistake or if I accidentally set something weird, but let's go ahead and hit render and see what we get. Okay, so you'll see that it's a little bit more speckly now. And we're going to zoom in and see why that is. Part of that is bump takes a little bit more to progressively render. So we're getting some artifacts on there, but I'm going to go ahead and zoom in just a touch. But I want you to see, like in this case, I don't think, because these are just like light surface scratches, right? We probably don't need, right, all of that crazy noise on there. It's kind of surprising, right, like how much additional distortion it's put on the surface of this object, which may be very useful in other cases, but in this case, it's not so fantastic. We could make some adjustments here to thin this out. We could also see what happens if we were to delete that and either go straight from our invert or straight from our original image. Now, if you remember, the original image is white with black scratches, right? And black means it's pushed in. So let's go ahead and see if that looks any better. If we just go straight from there. All right, so it's a little bit much. I'm going to refresh this again. It's a little bit much. I want you to note that there's a couple things going on too. It's really changed our model. This can be frustrating if you're working with bump maps, right? But it's basically pushed everything in, or it hasn't pushed everything in, but it's sort of ignoring the Phong tag completely right now. And it's really right, aggressive in how these scratches look. They're being pushed into that surface pretty intently right now. So there's one thing we can do that will make a slight change, but in this case, right, I don't think the bump is necessarily the choice that we want to make. And the way we stop this faceting from happening is we need to change the type of object this is. And this is part of the reason why I have these two heads in here. So I'm going to go ahead and move this so we can see both heads. You can see that, right, both now have all this faceting. That might be a neat aesthetic thing, but we'd like to be able to control it. So the way we control that is in our object hierarchy, we're going to select one of these heads. I'm going to select the one closest to the camera. And I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go down to my render tags and go to RS object, which just means this is a Redshift object. Now, you may be greeted in the attributes manager here with either basic or visibility turned on, but what we want to do is we want to go over to geometry, and we want to check mark override, and then we want to check mark tessellation enabled. What this does is basically this acts the same as a subdivision surface, right? So if I check mark this, you can see that suddenly I have a much cleaner surface than I did before, and it's actually cleaner than it was even before the tessellation started to happen on that surface. You will note that, right, this the bump is still pretty intense, and the way that I've done the color and everything, it's actually, right, causing some other issues with the way this is rendering. And we'll look at other examples of bump, and we'll look at displacement and things like that in another tutorial. But I wanted to show that you could map this over here if you wanted to. But if I turn this bump channel off, right, I have all those scratches, but I do want you to note that with that tessellation turned on that Redshift object, you can see that this is already, you can see the faceting on this one, but this is substantially smoother and more clean and kind of elegant looking. And if we go ahead and maybe save our patch and close this out, right, we now have this object. I'm going to go ahead and shrink a few more things so we can actually see this view. Okay, so yeah, so you can see right now we've got gold that's got some additional scratches and dust and things on it. It's not a perfect surface, it's still glossy, but it's got a lot more going on than it did before we did any of this. Okay, the only other thing we could potentially add that I would like to show before we end this is to select this material, and I don't need the node editor open for this, but I want to go down to this coat. And if I go to coat and I change this value, let's go ahead and I'm going to make this, I don't know what color to make this, but I remember when I said, like, depending on the colors that you are looking at in your lighting colors, this gold is going to look very different. And in this case, there's a lot of green in there. Right, and in here we might get, if we really look closely, you're going to see there's a touch of green in some of these other areas as well, and it's just like a hair, right? But it's there, and so let's go ahead and see if we can add just a tiny bit of green. And I'm going to start by making this green, and you'll note nothing happens because currently the weight is 0. I'm going to go ahead and make this weight 1. Oh, oops, I'm on emission, not on coat. Let's try this again. Let's go to, we don't want emission on for this. It kind of doesn't really do the best things for our gold in this case. So I'm going to crank this weight up to 1. And then you're going to see that if I drop this back down to 0, right, there's not a whole lot of change. It's really subtle. And index of refraction and roughness are going to be part of that. If I increase my roughness here, right, you're going to see that I'm going to start to get these like greenish halos on part of this gold. And if I go back to look at my model, specifically this one, right, that's going to be a little bit more obvious. Now this is like too green, right? This is a cooler green, and much less intense in color, right? And so then it's actually a little bit more bluish green like that, and I can probably keep pulling this up, or I could even adjust the weight here, right? But that roughness, if I keep cranking the roughness on this code up, you'll see that it's actually, right, it's going to apply a bit more evenly to the entire thing. If I adjust my index of refraction for this, you're going to see that that does some really weird behavior, and I'm actually kind of seeing through that model. If I go up higher, right, it's basically going to create more of a coat that overlays the entire thing, and it actually kind of blends very differently with the gold undercoat, right? So 1.5 is kind of a good middle ground. It really depends on, like, you have to look at the material you're working with and see which appears to be the most effective in terms of how this looks, right? And, you know, if you have something that's got like a milky thin coating on top of it, maybe you want your IOR lower, right? In our case, 1.5 is pretty good, as I said, and I've got my roughness set at 0.68 or something. I could adjust this color some to see if there's other, if something else would work better. If I go into a deeper tone, you can see that that has less of an effect, right? The brighter white, if I go all the way to white, it's going to be a little bit, more of a hazy coating on the surface. So really it just depends on, what you're going for. But I want to show you this as a way to add just like a tiny little bit more tint to your base object. Now, if we wanted this all to be much warmer, right, we could pop over into the red orange and actually go deeper into the red and maybe pull this over, and you'll see that, right, those highlights, it's hard to see because it's already warm. I'm going to go even deeper red to make it more obvious, and we'll see if we can even see this with how I have this set up. Oh, maybe it's because I haven't actually closed that. What the heck's going on here? I don't even know what color I was just adjusting. Maybe it just didn't apply, huh? Okay, so let's pop over here. There we go. Now it's actually adjusting the color. Right, but you can see, right, if I need it to be more of a red gold, in order to, like a warmer gold, this is something I can do as well, right? So this is like a thin coating. It helps to like just add a little something else on top of everything that we've got going on. Okay, and that's the end of this tutorial. You have now, from scratch, created your first node-based material. Congratulations. And we've made gold that has some minor scratches and smeariness on it. Yeah. And that's what we got.